cloud.
Yeah.
Here we are. Yeah, so it was, I think in the late 90s, we got this opportunity to do a brand new hospital in Thunder Bay, about just shy of 1 million square feet. And we started looking at what would we, how would we build it, and what would it represent? And I think what happened, that was really the beginning where we started to connect the dots that if we're building in a place that really the main economy, a lot of the jobs at that time was driven by the forestry and the pulp and paper industry, why wouldn't we use a material that speaks to that more as sort of a societal and a cultural issue compared to an environmental, which certainly we see and we hear a lot more. And so we did that. And at the time, obviously, it was a lot more complicated because the building codes weren't that evolved. And specifically to put it in an institutional building and on a building of that scale, arguably really hadn't happened in the country. I would say at that scale and that type of building. And as you well know, the use of wood, has an extraordinary history here, and clearly with the moderns. But there seemed to be a little period in between, certainly going through school, it wasn't really there. And so we got into that project, sort of fell in love again with the material, and then moved on to that Credit Valley project that might have been about 4 or 5 years later. And it was beginning to explore. The thing about the material from my standpoint was the one material that you could affordably build forms that were more sculptural, that were more complicated to do out of concrete or steel. I think right at the beginning of my career, I did one out of concrete that was trying to get something more sculptural, but in fact, it was for a company that manufactured sort of an early form of the Swiss company, Wholesome. But wood was the material that you could create something that was more expressive than any other material. Interestingly, for Credit Valley, it was used because it was trying to reflect their values in space. But when we did that, that's in Mississauga, and Mississauga isn't a walk in the park from the building officials. We had to bring in a sprinkler system from Europe called a fog system that basically takes a teeny drop of water and divides it into 1,000 droplets. It's used in conservation or library environments because it doesn't create the shower droplets. It effectively creates something that's like a fog that comes in from the coast, which reduces temperatures as well as sort of oxygen, as well as the water content in the air, and it puts fire out. But we had to go to the National Research Council with about 50 gallons of airplane fuel with a big timber log in the middle in a 3-story space, set the fog system up, and then bring all of these people down to get it approved. And interestingly, when they started it, only 2 of the heads went off and 1 didn't. And these flames jump up literally 3 stories. And 2 of the things go on, 1 doesn't. And so the one side of the flue lamp is charred, where the other is cool to the touch. But we were a hell of a long way down the path with the client about to tender this, and we didn't know if Mississauga would approve it because the codes weren't permissive of it at the time, and we got it approved. Curiously, the other story on that is that the Ministry of Health thought that the use of wood and the forms were beyond what they should be and perceived to be very expensive.
Right.
So what we had to do was to price our building against every other cancer center that was being built in Ontario at the time. And it was found to be less expensive because clearly if you take a piece of steel and you cut something out, there's a lot of waste. Obviously, gluing together a bunch of little 2x4s, there isn't. But that project had to go all the way to the Minister of Health to get it approved because the perception that wood was something that was lavish, and obviously we proved that it wasn't, and the minister approved it. But I think part of that, which I think what interests me now and is driving us, I don't think I've shared with you, which is a little bit of a backstory, but we've got a book that's coming out, that would be U of T Press that publishes, called Constructing Health. And it's looking at the neural and the physiological aspects of the environment.
That's where you came from on this, from the biophilic and the health, rather than starting from the low carbon environmental points.
That's right. And so probably stepping back from that, just before the pandemic, I applied and was accepted while running the firm to be a fly-in student at the University of Venice to complete a Master of Neuroscience applied to architecture and design. And so Venice is the first university that is offering this program in an emerging area of that intersection between neuroscience and architecture. And so as a fly-in student to Venice, I was there a week a month, certainly pre-pandemic, and then online to effectively write my thesis. But what that's really doing is looking at the mind, and conceptually that it isn't, housed in the skull. Your mind is embodied, meaning that your mind is connected to your gut, it's connected to your skin, to your organs. The interceptive things, the proprioceptive things, is really around your skin and the movement aspect. And the extraceptive is really that you've got a sense of what's behind you right now. Things change. And so your body isn't, your mind isn't housed in your mind, it is embodied within your overall body. But there's then the concept of the body and the mind that is meant to move through space and that phenomenology of space. And so the basis of that is the underpinning of this cause health idea, or this constructing health, is what's the relationship of what we build and its ability to actively cause the conditions of where you flourish. And so how do you define that? And the simple thing for me is like optimal health, and there's obviously a lot of definitions of what health and well-being is, which we spend a lot of time in the book trying to define that over a 5,000-year period, as opposed to the last 100 years, which is more of a Western evidence-based pathogenic view, meaning patho and genesis, the origins of disease, as opposed to a salutogenic view, meaning saluto, health, and genesis, obviously the origin, which comes out of Adam Nosky, which you probably know, an American-Israeli guy. But what is the relationship of the environment to actively cause health, as opposed to just stopping bad things from happening? And that ties back to this phenomenology and the neuroscience and the mind. And if you look at optimal health, then the way I would define it is like a tabletop that has 4 legs. And to get optimal health, you really need the 4 legs, or the table falls over. One of those legs is clearly the relationship of design and its impact on the health of the natural system and ecology. The second clearly is design's role in social health or societal health. And the whole idea of Black Lives Matters and the way the profession designed and zoned and separated people actively to stop things from happening, or clearly designed can do the opposite. The third then is physical health, which we clearly know in the active design guidelines and all of those things out of New York City, that really looks at, physical and ambulating and what we can do to enhance that. The fourth clearly is mind health. And I'm using mind health very specifically as instead of mental health, because mind health I'm defining more as an asset-based view or a salutogenic view of enhancing mind health, as opposed to mental health, which seems to be associated with more the deficit based view of the ability of our health, or more of a pathogenic view. That's a little bit of a simplification, but I think it is it's an important way of how we view the mind. And the program was fantastic because we were taught by sort of the first quarter with certainly the world's leading neuroscientists. A variety of them are based in Italy, but also neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, physiologists, sociologists, and it's really beginning to understand that everything comes in through here, and some is cognitive, some is precognitive, subconscious or otherwise. But it's extraordinary now, the material that's out there that's connecting the dots between mind, environment, and performance. And so I think what happened with that was all the stuff we were trying to do intuitively in the early days, like at Credit Valley, or some of the health stuff. And in fact, more recently, we've exploded certainly across Canada and globally in the education sector and health. All the stuff that I knew intuitively, in your gut, that we know as architects, where everybody says, where's the evidence to support it? These guys are presenting it all back to me. And suddenly, it was really amazing. And if I look at my age and stage of where I am in my life, I finally got to a stage where I think I am making sense of what I'm doing from the stuff that you sort of knew intuitively earlier, or you were trying to, grab at sticks and pieces along the way. But I think we're now getting at a stage that we're doing things intentionally, and it's both from a materiality, but also concepts, how buildings offer affordances, which is a big thing of the program. So that simple thing that if you come to a door and does it have the metal bar across it that you don't know if you should push or pull, or if the handle's designed that you intuitively know how to wrap your hand around it and pull or push. And then the idea of generosity tied to that comes out of concepts developed by Canadians in the 1940s, 50s, this idea of enriching environments, or as we've moved into enriched environments, or the elements of enriched environments. And so this guy, Herb, in the 1950s, that started in Canada, then moved into the 60s in the University of California at Berkeley. Effectively, what he found was that if you put mice, instead of lab mice, instead of lab cages, but if you put them into what he called enriching environments, it found, as we intuitively know, that it increased their ability to problem solving, reduced social problems, a whole range of things. But what he also discovered is that it increased by about 25% the amount of synapses, which are the important connections between neurons, the network. But it grew that at like a rate of 25% because of the environment. He took this information, and others going into Berkeley and onwards, and really began to translate it into things like the treatment of Alzheimer's, also moving into kids that have ADD or otherwise, like these snoozle rooms that you hear of. But effectively looking at the environment as a non-invasive therapeutic treatment to enhance memory, learning, empathy, problem solving, on and on and on, as a result of these so-called enriched environments. in my research for the thesis, working with a sociologist and a psychologist, is we began to dive into this thing which is called the constructed theory of emotion. There's a lady in the States, in fact, a Canadian, who has developed this theory that really looks at how do we form emotional relationships, primarily person to person. And the basis of it is that there are inputs that are sensory, which we all, like we know of it. It's from sound and touch and smell and taste and all of those. But those are inputs coming from an external environment, primarily from person to person. Those inputs come in and then they're interpreted. And they are interpreted through two things, which is what we've learned and what we've experienced, which is effectively cultural. So things that we've done, obviously our mind learns, and the other things we're fed, meaning that what my perspective is of you culturally, or otherwise, all of those sorts of baggage that are put over it. But through that interpretation from the input, then there is an output, which is a prediction, meaning that do I want to stay and talk to you because it's stimulating and amazing, and there are qualities. Then there's a thing called the circumplex, which is a diagram that was created to represent all of the emotions that we have. And there's sort of two aspects, two axes of it, roughly overlaid on the circle, which is around valiance, which is about intensity. And then the other axis is going from happy to sad. So we can imagine that we have emotions that we are very sad or very happy in this direction. And then there's the intensity of it, that you can be happy, but wanting to lie on your couch, or very, very stimulated. So if you look at her theory and the way we form emotions on the positive side, not that the negative isn't important, but if you focus on psychological output studies of what are enriched relationships, person to person, so you can imagine somebody who was a mentor to you, and that mentor, was generous. There was a legacy that was associated. There was variety and vitality, and it was natural and warm. And you can think of that going on the intensity scale down to, you think of your personal relationships that are intimate and solid and silent, and there's a stillness to it. Curiously, the way that our mind, through that inputs, predictions, and outputs, the way we form person-to-person relationships is very similar to the way and the characteristics that we form person-to-place relationships. And so what does that mean, or what's an example of it? Well, there's a variety of elements that in the book we're writing about, these elements of enriched environments, that the analogy is that they're not predictive. Like you don't take one and you put it in, check the box, and I've got this. Because similarly, your cultural background and experiences and mine conceivably can be quite different. And if the elements are more like ingredients is in food, the analogy, the simple one is if you take cinnamon, for example. Cinnamon, what does it tie back to in Western culture? Well, it's Christmas time, it's maybe a spiced wine, it might be in a spiced goose. But if you look at an Indian biryani, that cinnamon is often used within it, there are very different interpretations from cultural and past experiences for that. But the taste of cinnamon to me and you and somebody in India, there are underlying tones and flavors around that. And that those things relate back to some things in space that have similar characteristics. They're not predictive in the sense that, for example, if you said, okay, the element is a podium or a white pediment and white columns. Because I might view that, and you might view that culturally as something about solidness and orderliness and something that's positive and good. But if I grew up in South Africa or in the southern states and say I'm Black, that might speak very firmly to oppression and colonialism and uncertainty and worry. And so that's why these ingredients are important. And this idea, one of them is generosity. And so if you look at generosity, back to your mentor, who was giving and doing things for, that weren't asked, architecture is very similar. And so if you think of a city street, that has 6 lanes of traffic racing by, a narrow little sidewalk, a building beside it that the windows are boarded up or don't have windows, there's no canopy, that's not generous. If you look at an architecture as a parallel street, for example, that would say it has cobblestones, it has benches, it has trees, has a canopy if it's raining, it has a cafe, you can hear the sound of voices, you might want to linger and sit and spend time. Well, you can begin to think of, at the outset of project, a variety of different characteristics of architecture that have a relationship parallel to the positive side of person-to-person relationships that can be translated to person-to-place. And so what it's beginning to try and do and look at is, when we start with clients or others and talk about what are the qualities and characteristics that we're trying to translate, is to begin to talk about, if a building was a person and your organization is a person that you're trying to communicate qualities and characteristics, let's begin to look at what they are on your and my relationship, and what that relationship will be person to person, to the people that are using it, to be able to articulate it in that way. And then through the research from Venice and the writing in the book, that then what do those characteristics and qualities look like in an architecture? But like the pediment and the columns, they will be different because of culture. But that taste, like the cinnamon here, or in the Indian biryani, or a double meat pie in Trinidad, the qualities of that taste, of the sweetness, or the subtle, or the quiet, or whatever, they have roots in the mind's eye that begin to be more universal, but with the overlay of the culture and learned and past experiences. And so those are the qualities that we're beginning to derive, which tie back to a phenomenology. And if we then tie back to wood, the curious thing of wood is that we're focused on it on an ecological standpoint, but the role of it is much more important if we look at that broader view of health. And the table with the 3 legs, if you look at Thunder Bay, we used wood because it was representing something of the community, and that when you walked in, it spoke to you. And in fact, we've heard that on a variety of different fronts, but then maybe that's a longer story, that it has had significant impact. We do know that wood, from an economic standpoint, economic health, clearly using the material that we manufacture, we engineer, and we produce in Ontario, that's very important from economic health, societal health. If we then look at economic and societal health, because there's a cultural overlay, if we then look at the physiological standpoint, which we've got in the book. In fact, we just finished a paper for the largest health authority in Vancouver on using wood in long-term care facilities, is we know that it lowers your blood pressure. This is all stuff that you want to linger further. There's qualitative aspects, but those are physiological reactions in your body because of the way your mind perceives them. and there's also studies about enhanced learning, empathy, all of these things related to wood. But that's performance. That's human performance in where you work or where you learn. And so while, in fact, the book, the Australian Wood Council is backing us on it because they talk a lot about economic health of using wood, what it's doing. They talk a lot about ecological health of it, but very few people are looking at human performance as a result of the material. And so you look at the European Forest Institute. I was just there with them, had a keynote a month ago in Barcelona. They're similarly interested because they're looking at the BioCity, which I think is really interesting in the role of forest and wood and construction. But now they're beginning to understand what it does to this thing up here about human performance. And the one thing that I find with our clients is everybody gets it. Everybody understands that the environment, the whole carbon aspect for our education clients, we say, okay, this dining hall we've opened for you, the embedded carbon in that building is the same as all the cars in your parking lot driving for a year. It's very important for them. But then when I talk to them in their community about the human performance overlay, that gets significantly, as do the other institutional clients, because this is about the people that are being housed there. And so it's an area that I'm trying to focus on, this mind-human performance side of it, because I think the profession isn't, I don't think we're spending enough time as we should, because when we speak to certainly the ecological and the governance aspects of sustainability, both social and ecological, is obviously institutional clients going up the food chain in a rapid way. But how do we create the conditions where we can thrive as a main driver? And that thriving is human, cultural, and ecological. That's the laser focus that we have on absolutely everything we're working on.
Well, that's amazing. You just talked for 20 minutes without
blah, blah, blah.
I'm certainly glad I had you hit the record button, because I'm going to be spending a lot of time on the transcript.
I'll send you the book, which might be helpful.
Oh, very much so. I had a thought about 5 minutes ago when you were saying something, and you know that, like, I spend a lot of time talking about comfort and the concept of that nobody understands in the basic housing and building world of mean radiant temperature, where our body has 250,000 thermal sensors, and we feel cold when our body is losing heat, radiating it to a colder surface, and we feel warm when it's coming the other way. So my question to you about wood is, I was just thinking about this while you were talking, that wood has a very different thermal character than steel. 100%. So I'm just wondering, when you're in a building with a steel frame or a concrete frame, even though they're probably going to be pretty close to room temperature if they're inside, while you're talking about how our skin and our body and everything works together with our brain, I was just curious, do you think we're feeling the nature of the wood thermally?
100%. And that's the thing, that it's multi-sensory. It's multimodal sensory, the environment, and clearly specifically wood, because wood has a touch to it, which is different than steel, meaning that wood doesn't, well, as we know, if you have a wood handle on your pot, when you're cooking something, it's not radiating or taking the heat from you, which the other materials do. So there's a balancing of the material.
That's touch. I'm talking about radiation in a distance.
There's radiating distance to your skin. As you know, your skin is one of the biggest organs in your body. So it's very different than steel. or glass or concrete. But I think the piece is that perception in your mind's eye is you are perceiving it to be warmer than the other material. So the way your mind works is with the different regions in it. Some is on the visual cortex, some is in the sound and the sight and the smell. The way that the brain works is that when you see, when you smell, when you touch, if you just say the visual, is what happens is something instantly reminds you of somewhere else. You can really work yourself when you see or you have a thought, spend the time on what it's connecting to, something else. When you see this wood wall or the one behind you, it reminds you of something else, but it also, what your mind is doing is connecting the dots of everything else in that sensory experience. And so what your mind is beginning to tell you is the last time I was around this wood environment, it was a place that was warm and I felt warm. And in fact, I felt like I wanted to stay around. And so the perception of warmth, are you feeling warm right now? You may not be actually any different than you are somewhere else. But all of the multimodal senses in your mind is beginning to communicate, in fact, that you are feeling warmer. And so one is actually the sensory change of absolute temperature, but there's also this thing that's beginning to fill in the dots of warmth and all of the other things that make for a warm environment, a warm discussion, a place again to linger, as opposed to something that's cold that you don't want to spend the time in. And so I think that part is really important because it and specifically around the wood, because it's warmth. Then if you begin to move into qualitative aspects, such as comfort or quality not being sort of, well, actually you can think of quality and marble. You know, if it's a big marble, which is quality and expensive, sometimes those places remind us of a bank hall that we don't want to linger on. Right. If you think of quality as it relates to wood, that's communicating specifically in a healthcare environment that this must be a quality experience because they're using wood, and I associate wood with maybe culturally, but also from a biophilia standpoint of growth and age and longevity, that these things begin to arguably come into that larger view of how do I scientifically perceive the change of temperature as it relates to wood or steel. But if I'm in a steel environment, am I perceiving that it's cooler, both from a temperature, but also from a cultural and past experience? And that comes back to a concept that I think is fundamental. And in fact, the guy who discovered this, extraordinary guy who discovered this concept of neural mirroring. And so what does that mean? It means that, well, here's a simple example of it. The very simple one is, you know, that example that if you see a baby, or if a baby sees you smile, what does the baby do? The baby smiles back. If I jump on this call with you and you've got a big grin on your face, I have a grin because I think you're going to share something that's funny with me. I'm mirroring what I'm seeing through you. You know, the facial example is a very simple one. If you dig deep a little further into architecture, a simple one would be a Gothic cathedral. You know, what is that symbolizing? This is symbolizing this, right? And what do? Your eyes get lifted up, your body begins to lift up, and there is that perception. You're mirroring what the architecture is doing. So this neuroscientist discovered this concept of neural mirroring, that he looked at a bunch of apes, and if you did X, Y, or Z, they began to do the exact mirroring. Interestingly, it clearly occurs in architecture and what we communicate. And that might be the materiality and the perception as it relates to wood, either just as a plane that's behind you, or if you look at a lot of the shapes that we're using in the vocabulary and the ability to easily bend and shape wood, we're trying to actively communicate something. And that then relates to another layer, which is this concept of positive ambiguity. And positive ambiguity also then begins to have an overlay to a lot of the work that a professor in Seattle is doing on this whole, which I'm sure you're well versed on, and that whole fractal pattern, meaning that different forms and shapes, obviously that are coming out of nature, that he argues that there is a visual sweet spot, meaning that if the pattern is too complex, we get confused with it. If it's too simple, we're bored. Interestingly, his study, Richard, lost his name, he actually was studying nature, but then, you know, what he moved into was Jackson Pollock paintings. So why are Jackson Pollock paintings so popular? And why do people want to throw tens of millions of dollars at them? What he discovered was that if you look at the fractal complexity of Pollock paintings and the sweet spot of nature that so resonates with us, the fractal complexity is exactly the same. And it's amazing. And so there's a layer of that, but that begins to move into these ideas of positive ambiguity. So what the mind finds really interesting is it likes to compare and contrast. And so simple, black and white. Well, from our mind's eye, it's very simple we instantly, your mind, because of through your retinas, there are a variety of things that either look at shape or straight lines, cross lines, diagonal lines, and it moves on in the retina and how the brain begins to work. Your body, your brain, which is used as about 30% of the energy of your body, which is a lot for one organ, it is shaped to make predictions very quickly. And it's done that for a very simple reason, meaning, is that animal going to gobble me up or is it not?
Right.
Pretty simple as it goes way back. So this predictive nature, which goes back to the theory of constructed emotion, is we want to make predictions. Some things we can do very quickly, like the horizon in a straight line or a view down a long corridor. That we see it, we instantly, and we don't really engage with it much further than that because prediction is made. When things then get further into that complexity sweet spot, like the Jackson Pollock painting or other things, or I should say, when they go beyond that, we know some things that certainly visually or we experience through our body, moving through it, they're too complex, they're confusing, and we don't want to spend time thinking about it because effectively it's hurting the brain. But there are other spots that are in that sweet spot that your mind has to compare and contrast. And it's like a mental gymnasium for the brain that we become really, really stimulated. And so simple things would be if you begin to look at curved lines, that your mind follows, you know, and wraps around it as it's trying to make sense. If you look at a triangle, they're points, they're sparks that start and stop as you move along. When these forms begin to start becoming mixed together, and this is obviously a very simplification of it, is that there is more gymnastics that your mind has to do to make sense of it that can create real pleasure. And it's amazing that when you begin to start looking and analyzing things on where these sweet spots are, they become very interesting. And that comes into this concept of positive ambiguity that we've tried to articulate, at least in the writing. But it relates back to intentionally creating these enriched environments. And so Credit Valley, with the tree-shaped things, the big curves and the arches, and then the branches that come off of it. Interestingly, that it seems to resonate with people and has over a 20-year period because, and I don't have the full scientific evidence on it at this stage, but I believe it is in the sweet spot of that positive ambiguity and that fractal patterning between the curves and the triangles and the asymmetries that you move through it. It is continually changing because of that idea of embodiment, the movement of it, as opposed to the static things. But back to beginning to maybe making sense of what I'm doing finally at this stage in my life, is the stuff that we were doing before quasi-intuitively. I think I'm beginning to make sense of it as a result of this study, certainly in the neuroscience. And in fact, now Venice, I'm beginning to teach there at the program, which is kind of fun. But the writing of this book is, I'm trying to go deep into what health is, because over 5,000 years from traditional Chinese medicine, Aboriginal views of health, the whole way through, except for from 1910 on, effectively, that we had a pathogenic view of evidence-based Western medicine. And now I think we're just beginning to emerge out of it. So it begins to look at that. It begins to look at generosity and affordances. It looks at how the mind works from a cognitive science standpoint. The whole purpose is really to open the light in a understandable way of what this thing is in human performance.
So we have cinnamon sort of being different in India than in Toronto, just because of cultural differences. We have Thunder Bay. Everybody loves trees. They walk in and they feel at home with trees. So how does this play in Jerusalem with no trees and a stone city? Do they look at wood differently? Do they walk in and have a different sense than people walk into in Thunder Bay?
That, for me, is very interesting on a couple of levels. One is wood seems to have a universal perception of quality, time, age, growth, and a continuum as a result of it. There is a perception all tied to that. And that, I think, like the cinnamon, is universal. Curiously, Jerusalem, there are no building codes that enable wood as a starting point. There's no fire code.
Yeah, and I thought they had codes that required it to be stone, Jerusalem stone.
And that came out of the British mandate, that every building had to be built out of it. We had to get our way around that with the chief architect, who's like the czar of Jerusalem. And that's an interesting, for me, story that we were allowed to do this. But we started, let me step back on what wood represents in that building also. Jerusalem has, through its, obviously, the top eight oldest cities in the world, Jerusalem has always been built of stone. And so if you look at, the bottom of the Temple Mount, it's amazing to go in to see stones that are bigger than a transport truck. And stone was always used as a material that tried to reflect permanence, but also that couldn't be destructed. And obviously we know that for the most part, the city was destructive. It was torn down and demolished. The cancer center is intentionally being used out of wood because it's representing fragility. And the symbol of the building and the metaphor that it's being known of is a butterfly. And why a butterfly? Well, there's a variety of layers, in fact, which was the first story that we talked to the client about. That is, a butterfly it has two qualities to it. One is absolute beauty and marvel at this gorgeous thing that in the color, the shape, and the form, and everything else, and the way that it moves. But equally, fragility. is that it can be crushed and destroyed in an instant. And so this idea of the butterfly as a metaphor of a cancer center and life is a very important piece, that your life of a journey is extraordinary and beautiful and wonderful and magical, but it is fragile. And cancer clearly is a piece. But a butterfly also is a metaphor of transformation, meaning going from a caterpillar and a metamorphosis into something else. That's a very important message to communicate to people who are going to treat people for cancer, but also if you're going in on a journey also. And wood, in the sense of it is growing, it is natural, or was growing, it is natural. The forms and equally quality are very important conscious and subconscious messages that are communicated to you as you move into the building. And the center of the building, which is now open, you know, the whole lower floor, the center thing is a massive garden. The whole floor is a garden that is growing alive, but also the architecture is growing up and bending and curving which is similar to the radiation treatment bunkers, trying to communicate the message of something that is alive and growing, as opposed to the pathogenic view of death and dying, because all of these things speak to us on a conscious level, but also subconscious. As you well know, when you walk through a door, you walk through a threshold to any environment, it is communicating consciously and subconsciously to you of the experience that you're going to have. And so this idea of the elements of enriched environments or enriching environments, back to the early stuff, is the architecture has to be a non-physical intervention that has the ability to enhance health. And so, as a side note, the chief radiologist, who in fact on his board of this foundation of hope that he's created, that he's infusing hope as a multimodal form to reduce anxiety and pain through cancer treatment. One of his advisors on his board was in fact the partner of Antonovsky, who created this idea of salutogenesis. So I meet this guy, I start talking about salutogenesis, and he says, oh yeah, I know about it, it's X, Y, Z. So in the radiation treatment rooms, he's working with a neuroscientist, quite an extraordinary Israeli, in fact, who was Harvard, MIT, and now is back running his own lab. But they have multimodal sense, sound, scent, and visual for people that are in CT scanners or otherwise, because he has scientifically proved that these concepts of hope that relate to what we're trying to do on the space improve cancer outcomes because of this multi-sensory aspect to what we know architecture is. And so it's trying to tie all of those things back to this idea of how can you create the conditions of where you thrive? How can architecture cause health? How can you construct health in this larger sphere of interlocking circles of what health was always perceived through Aristotle, through ancient Chinese medicine, the intersecting circles of health from Aboriginal. Like, we've had this forever and ever, but we've sort of taken a pause through really the 1900s. But clearly it's coming back. So that's the cause that we're on the mission for.
Well, this has been fantastic, and I'm going to be studying what you've said here, running it through that Otter AI to translate it into words so I can look at this again. Can I use some photos from your website? I want to write a story about this. Is there any limitations? Okay.
No, whatever you want. I mean, the whole, stepping back, the basis of why are we doing the book? One is to make sense of what I'm doing, or try to make sense of what I'm doing. and the other is to disseminate, and obviously
Yeah, I
once
want
you,
to send it to me if you can. You know, I have to tell
yeah,
you, I loved hearing what you were saying, that you're finally at this age figuring out what you've been doing and what you've been thinking. I mean, I just turned 70 and I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm just realizing this is what I've been thinking. This is what I'm saying. And I'm just starting my second book. And
are you really?
finally realizing, you know, this is what I've been thinking about for 20 years. And now I'm finally going to write about it. And it's quite exciting. So I know the feeling. I'm glad you've got a good press to work with there. So it's going to be exciting to see.
Yeah, it's laid out the first part of it's being edited, the second half. You know, Sasha Hastings,
Yeah.
she's
And
she's been helping on the editing, and the second or the last third hasn't been edited, but I think really what she's been able to do, I think the words were walking on the page. I'm not a writer like you are, and
yeah,
she allows the words to dance on the page, and
well,
obviously like you do. But anyways, you'll see that some parts are a little rougher, but I hope it communicates the ideas, and I'll share it with you after this talk.
okay. And you don't say it in your site. How many people are in your firm now?
We hover around 15, and we are working across Canada. We are in Vancouver, very busy. We're in Dublin, Ireland, with a significant project. We just finished a third campus in Jerusalem that's 700,000 square feet. So
Wow.
we're doing very, very big projects. Everything
Are they all
through,
done in association with local firms? Like
we always associate, so the whole co-creation is important, but we are leading the design, but we're also doing construction drawings and construction administration. So the whole idea of going from one side to the other is very important, but we've really got a very nimble team. But I think really some fabulous people that I'm collaborating in the house. But equally interestingly, you look at the Butterfly Project, we're working with people on 6 countries, on I don't know how many time zones, and we firmly sort of shifted into that zone, which from a collaborative standpoint, I think it's helped us along, that's for sure.
and your little table that I got one and something like 30 years ago is still holding plants. It's still
funny,
together,
I was just looking
right
at that
on top of me.
I was just thinking of that on the weekend. Actually, I was just looking at it. It's a long, long path. Is it 30 years? I think
It must be.
tables and buildings seem to age twice as fast as humans, or at least that's
Right.
I can't believe it's that long. But anyways, nice to see you, that's for sure. And
Wonderful to talk to you and listen to you. This is quite amazing. It's going to take me some time to digest. And if you can send me the recording, I'd really appreciate it. And whatever you've got, like if I can see some of the book, and that would be
okay,
fantastic.
I'll send it to you right now, that's for sure.
Okay.
I'll bounce the recording in the book shortly. Nice to see you. I look forward to staying in touch sooner than later, instead of the long break, that's for sure. Stay well.
Absolutely. You too.
All the best.